Hey everyone, welcome to the January 3rd, 2024 edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski as the TimeformUS podcast kickoff in the year 2024. Feels a little weird saying that after the new year for the first time, but a new year has begun. All the horses have turned 1 year older. Apparently some people don't like me saying that because the horses, of course, do have individual birthdays, but we're all betters here. And for those purposes, the horses did turn 1 year older at midnight on January 1st. So on this podcast, we're going to sort of straddle the new year and take a look back at 2023. Craig and I think just yesterday each submitted our Eclipse Award ballots. So as promised, prior to us taking a break for a couple of weeks, we'll discuss those Eclipse Award votes that we settled on, as we often do on this podcast around this time of year. And then towards the end, we'll get to some racing that just happened, both at the end of 2023 and then one race from New Year's Day 2024. So talk about some of those newly turned 3-year-olds and also some races that took place at the very end of last year when racing resumed just after Christmas Day at Santa Anita. We'll talk about that Grade 1 Malibu as well as some others from this past holiday week. Craig, good to be back doing the podcast with you.
Yeah, it's good. It was nice. Always good to take a break, get some refreshment, get re-energized. And it's that time of year now where, as you mentioned, the 2-year-olds turn 3, and I would imagine most of the focus is going to go towards the march to the Kentucky Derby and the first Saturday in May. But before we get there, it's always good to kind of take a look back and see what we thought about last year.
Yeah, I always feel like I'm never ready for how early the Kentucky Derby speculation starts. I mean, we did run that one Kentucky Derby prep that we'll talk about at the end of the show at Oaklawn Park on New Year's Day, and people already talking about that horse as a Kentucky Derby candidate. I feel like I still have so much to wrap my head around with regard to how that Kentucky Derby picture will ultimately shape up, but I think we've got a lot of time between now and then to sort out our thoughts, and we get a little bit of a break before some major Derby preps happen at the end of the month. So not going to focus too much on that discussion yet, but we will talk about some of these divisions as they relate to the way things ended last year. And Craig, we haven't often, I think we do our Eclipse Award discussion before each of us sends in our ballots, and this year we didn't really talk about it at all. So I'm kind of interested to see where we diverge and where we agree. I think I have an inkling of how that'll go because we've talked about some of these throughout the year 2023 before taking this break in the final 2 weeks of December. But I know I personally changed my mind in a few categories, really 2 or 3 categories. I changed my mind sort of at the last second. A few of them I sort of left up in the air. One of them was the Horse of the Year category. I think that's the most hotly debated and the most up for interpretation of all of these Eclipse Award categories, because it's one of those years where I'm personally not somebody who is ever looking to abstain from voting, even in categories where I don't have a strong opinion. I just sort of look at the data and force myself to make a decision. That's just what I've decided for myself. But I know some other people view it differently. And if they don't see a clear winner, they're happy to abstain. Or if they didn't do a lot of research in a category, they're happy to abstain from voting in a category. And it's one of those years where I could understand some people abstaining from voting for Horse of the Year because either there are a lot of worthy winners or there are no worthy winners, depending on the way you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at it as it's Horse of the Year, so somebody had to be the best. I would never abstain from Horse of the Year. I guess I would get if somebody wanted to, but I'm also one that doesn't ever abstain in any of the categories. As same as you, it's not that hard to set aside a little time and do the work and the things you aren't familiar with. For me, steeplechase racing, I wasn't. I appreciated your thread that you did on Twitter about that apprentice jockey. I won't pretend to follow apprentices throughout the year. I know who they are on the bigger circuits, but it just doesn't take that long to do the work and figure out who you think is worthy. So I voted in every category. I was like you. I changed a couple categories, including Horse of the Year, kind of as I really sat down and did the work. I thought I had my mind made up, but I didn't. I was swayed by what I was looking at on paper. So, and also I watched a lot of the races again. But yeah, it's something I do take pretty serious. I think it's an honor to be able to vote for it. So it's something I look forward to every year.
Yeah, I definitely echo those sentiments. I think we view it very similarly with regard to those key points. And let's begin our discussion as we talk first about Horse of the Year. I think we'll both tweet out our ballots as we put out this podcast later today. We're recording this on Wednesday morning, so you can follow along as you're listening. So the top line, Horse of the Year, Craig, I'll just say before I get to my vote, I really thought I knew who I was voting for the night after Breeders' Cup Saturday. I kind of made up my mind based on what we had just seen and knowing that no races after that were really going to have any implications on Horse of the Year. And I thought about it more through the month of December. I sort of changed my mind. I sort of settled upon a different opinion going into voting. And then I sat down yesterday to really finalize things. And I ended up going back to my first impression and my original opinion, which I had on Breeders' Cup Saturday, and went back to the horse that I thought I was going to vote for that day after kind of going away from that one. It's a situation where I think there's a big favorite to win this award, and that would be Cody's Wish. And I understand the votes for Cody's Wish. I'll say I did not vote for Cody's Wish, but I totally get the case for him. He definitely is not the most deserving winner of the award. Going back, looking through the history of who's won this award in the past and their resumes, I have just a principle of voting against the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile winner for Horse of the Year because I just feel like it's not a race that's quite on the level of other Breeders' Cup races for the older horses. It's not a championship division. It's not a true championship race. And often it doesn't draw a true championship field or even a true grade one field. So I have that against him, but I mean, when you just look at his Met Mile in isolation, you could argue that was the best, if not one of the best performances of the year, being one of the best fields assembled this year. So just based on that one effort, I get voting for him. And then, of course, you've got those intangibles, the story around Cody's Wish, the connection with Cody Dorman. And I know that sentimentality moved a lot of people, and people do take that kind of stuff into consideration when they're considering the Horse of the Year award.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'll honestly be surprised if Cody's Wish doesn't win. I think he's the heavy favorite, and for all the reasons you mentioned, I think he'll get the most votes. I didn't vote for him either. I wound up with him third. I'll just get into who I did vote for. When the Breeders' Cup ended, I was pretty sure I was going to vote for Idiomatic just because I thought she had the best resume. I don't think she's the best horse. I think there's better horses out there, but she just did everything she was asked to do. She ran a lot, and I liked it, but I liked her, everything she did this year. But the more I looked at it, I just decided that I was going to go with who I thought was the best horse. And the horse I settled on was Up to the Mark. I voted for him for Horse of the Year in first. I put Idiomatic second and Cody's Wish third. Idiomatic just did very little wrong. He didn't win the Breeders' Cup Turf, but I thought he ran great. Perhaps ran the best race that day. He was only beaten by a great ride by a 3-year-old who was even getting some weight, and he had a setback during the year. He had to miss some big time over the summer, and he came back and was just every bit as good as he was before. So I wound up going with Up to the Mark. He's not a perfect candidate. Any horse that gets voted for Horse of the Year this year is going to have some flaws, but in the end, that's how I went. Best horse got my first place vote.
Well, this is funny, Craig. We didn't talk about it at all, and our top three are exactly the same in that order. I thought I was going to vote for Up to the Mark right after Breeders' Cup Day because the one horse that we haven't discussed yet is White Barrio, and I will get to, I think, a deeper discussion about that when we get to the older dirt mail category. He was a horse that was good for a brief period of time from the end of the summer until the Breeders' Cup. And for me, I sort of look at longevity, horses that have had a full season when I'm considering the Horse of the Year award in particular. They don't tell us what criteria we're supposed to use, but as voters, I think we're supposed to decide what really matters most to us. So that's something that does matter to me a little bit when I'm looking at the Horse of the Year category. And as you were kind of getting at, there were two horses that really checked those boxes. Idiomatic being one of them, and Up to the Mark the other. I mean, they both started their careers and over the winter, January, February, were winning then, and were winning or coming very close to winning very tough races at the end of the year. Idiomatic, for a long time I thought I was going to vote for her. She wasn't my first impression, but for basically the entire month of December, I was expecting I was going to vote for Idiomatic. And kind of like you, when I sat down to look at it and sort of went back over the history of Horse of the Year awards, I had trouble making a case for a female horse that had never run against males or never even toyed with the idea of running against males, and also was not the most dominant Breeders' Cup Distaff winner that we've ever seen. She sort of eked it out, and we'll give her the benefit of the doubt for just barely getting the job done, because she certainly had some dominant victories prior to that. And she really did beat everybody that mattered in that older filly division and also the 3-year-old filly division. The problem is the competition in that division wasn't consistently at their best all year. She sort of ran into some horses like Nest and Clairiere, maybe when they were on the downward slide. And she was a little bit opportunistic in that sense, even though she deserves all the credit in the world for running as much as she did and getting the job done on a consistent basis. I didn't feel like she got that true test of quality that a female horse really needs to get to be the Horse of the Year. The only one that I can really point to in the past that is a similar situation would be Azeri, who never faced males when she won Horse of the Year that she won the Breeders' Cup Distaff, but she was a dominant Breeders' Cup Distaff winner that year, leaving no doubt that she was far and away better than the other females. And I can't say that Idiomatic quite did that. It was close, but I ultimately couldn't quite get there. And I was going back over Up to the Mark's year in 2023. It would have been so easy if he had won the Breeders' Cup Turf. I think that would have made him a slam dunk for this award, just given how strong that field came up. But, I want to give the connections props for running this horse in the tough races. I mean, as you said, he missed that time over the summer. They could have played it safe. They could have not tried the Breeders' Cup Turf after all of that, just given the fact that he did not have ideal preparation for that race. But they stuck to their guns and they went right back to the original plan with this horse, trying the most ambitious spot possible. I think a lot of us thought that they were crazy for running there instead of the Breeders' Cup Mile, especially given the fact that he had beaten the horse who was in the photo finish for the Breeders' Cup Mile on Breeders' Cup Saturday. But Up to the Mark, I mean, he ran his guts out in that turf. Horses that were right around him, some heavy hitting Europeans and Japanese horse that shipped in. I mean, they're arguably making the Breeders' Cup Turf the toughest test of an American horse that ran on the entire Breeders' Cup card. I think the Breeders' Cup Turf was the strongest field assembled, and Up to the Mark ran really well in that race. Arguably was the best horse. He didn't get quite as good a trip as the winner, Auguste Rodin, but I want to give him all the credit for winning that race. He beat strong competition on multiple occasions, particularly when he was able to outrun Master of the Seas to the wire in that Keeneland Turf Mile at the end of the season. And he had that longevity. I know that some people sort of view a turf horse like a filly or mare in the Horse of the Year category, but for me, just given the way that the turf and dirt divisions came up this year, I think it's totally viable to vote for a turf horse. It's not like this older dirt male division was as strong as we've seen in the past. And unlike the dirt males, who had to beat a couple of Japanese shippers, the turf horses of this country, they've got to step up against some tough Euros at the end of the season that inevitably ship into the United States. And Up to the Mark held his own against them. So I wanted to give him the most credit for that. And Craig, we ended up with the same Horse of the Year ballot.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. Surprising, really. I didn't know which way you would go, so I guess I shouldn't say surprising. But yeah, I think it's a well thought out argument. I'm with you. I didn't talk about Cody's Wish much. Like I said, I think he'll win the award. I think he was obviously very good, but I view the dirt mile the same way as you do. I feel like it just is not on the level of some other races. His Met Mile was good. When you look back at the field, White Obaria was in there. He didn't really run much that day, so I couldn't give him as much credit as I could a Breeders' Cup race. So I'm pretty happy with my votes. I'll be curious to see how it plays out. I've seen some others. I saw Marcus Hirsch, our colleague, also had Up to the Mark on top when he posted his ballot. So maybe I'll be surprised, but I doubt it. I still think Cody's Wish is going to win.
Yeah, I do believe Cody's Wish will win as well. And the margins were so close, Craig. I mean, if he had been a more decisive winner of the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, I think it would have been a tougher decision for me. But he really had to eke it out over a horse in National Treasure, who I personally think is not among the best 3-year-olds in the country. And that just was it was an unusually weak Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile that he barely won. I know it came up with a fast speed figure. I'm not, putting a ton of stock in that. So it just bothers me a little bit with Cody's Wish that they had these ambitions for him in the middle of the season, and once he failed to perform in the Whitney, they just set their sights so much lower and retread ground that they had already walked at the end of the season in the prior year. And just for me, I don't want to reward a horse that takes the easy way out, and I thought that he did. So I wanted to go in a different direction to a horse and up to the mark who took the opposite path and got really ambitious at the end of the season and nearly met the mark. I mean, he was almost up to it. And I think in a year where you don't have any other deserving candidates, that's good enough for him to get the first place vote.
Yeah, I agree. And I know we spent a lot of time on Horse of the Year, but I'm not too worried about it because some of these categories, especially the next couple we're going to get into, should take about 30 seconds, I would think.
Yeah, let's go through some of the other categories as we move down the ballot here. Both of the juvenile categories, I think, were pretty straightforward, Craig. Fierceness, the 2-year-old male. For me, I just kind of imposed the results of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile onto my top 3. Fierceness over Muth and Locked. They were all horses who accomplished graded victories in 2023, but Fierceness obviously won the race that counted. And similar thing with the 2-year-old filly. Just FYI, she is the obvious winner of this award. Only ran 3 times, but passed every test. I do have the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf winner in there, and hard to justify for second, just given the fact that the other 2-year-old fillies that ran on the dirt didn't really achieve anything that that necessarily made them a rival to Just FYI. So I did put Hard to Justify in there, along with Jody's Pride, the second place finisher in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. But those 2 categories, at least on the top slot, seemed pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and it seems so far we're exactly the same. I had the first 3 in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile for males, and for females, Just FYI, Hard to Justify, and Jody's Pride. I thought it was pretty straightforward for both of those.
And just to reiterate for people that aren't that familiar with Eclipse Award voting, really it's only the first place vote that counts. They make you give a top 3. The second and third preferences are mostly used in situations where there is such an overwhelming winner that there aren't enough votes to fill out the other 2 spots as finalists that they would announce for the award. So generally, the second and third place finishers don't matter that much in terms of the actual voting or who's the winner. So just wanted to lay that out there in case people are a little confused by us giving first, second, and third preferences. It's what you're asked to do as an Eclipse Award voter. Let's move on to the 3-year-old categories. I think the 3-year-old male category, pretty straightforward for the winner, Craig. Arcangelo didn't have as dominant a season as some past winners of this award, but really nobody else in this division matched his accomplishments of victories in major classic races like the Belmont and the Travers. That just gave him a leg up on everybody else. It would have been nice to see what he could have done at the end of the year in the Breeders' Cup Classic. Obviously had a setback and could not participate in that race. But even having ended his season in August, he was the pretty clear winner of this award.
He will be, but I actually went a little bit different direction. I put him second, but I went with Auguste Rodin. I know Arcangelo won the 2 classic races, if we're going to count the Travers as a classic, and I kind of do count it as one. It's not a Triple Crown race, but it's almost like the 4th race. But I hated that he skipped the prep race in between. He wasn't able to show up in the Breeders' Cup, so he basically missed the whole championship part of the season after the Travers. Auguste Rodin, he was able to win the Breeders' Cup Turf against an extremely strong field. He had some very good accomplishments in Europe. So I just wanted to go a different direction. I did not think very much of the 3-year-olds this year. They didn't run particularly fast. It looked like it was going to be a good crop early on, and it just didn't materialize. So that's the way I went. In third, I actually picked the Turf Force Program Trading, who I thought was very good. He was wound up being probably the best 3-year-old among what was a very strong group of 3-year-old turf horses. So I'm sure my vote, it's not going to carry much weight because I know that Arcangelo is going to win, but his campaign was just a little bit light for me.
I agree. It was a little bit light. This is one of those discussions of voters' principles. And for me, I kind of, when I do this exercise, I just start out with a few ground rules. And one of my ground rules is that I just don't vote for horses who only ran once in this country, in every category. It's not something I do. So I didn't even really consider Auguste Rodin. To me, he didn't have an American campaign. He had an American race. And I'm just not going to consider horses like that. I totally understand that his Breeders' Cup Turf was a stronger performance than maybe any other American 3-year-old produced on dirt or turf in this country. But for me, I just didn't view him as being eligible for the award, in my view. I totally get that other people view it differently. So he's not in my top 3. I did settle on Arcangelo for my second and third choices. What I did was I kind of came up with a point system because I think, and we can, this is going off on a bit of a tangent, Craig, but I think just counting grade 1 races is becoming less and less meaningful as you try to determine these awards, because I think comparing races like the Pennsylvania Derby and the Santa Anita Derby to races like the Belmont and the Travers, I mean, 2 grade 1s versus 2 grade 1s. Well, yeah, they're both grade 1s, but they're on a completely different level. The Belmont and the Travers obviously matter so much more than the Pennsylvania Derby. So I kind of went through, and before I even went about deciding who I was going to vote for, I made a list of the top races in the division and sort of assigned a point value to them, with the Kentucky Derby, or I should say the Breeders' Cup Classic, getting the most points. Obviously, a 3-year-old didn't win the Breeders' Cup Classic, but then the Kentucky Derby, and then the Belmont and the Travers and the Preakness, and so on down the list of races for 3-year-olds that are of importance. And Arcangelo, the obvious winner, when you start to add up the points, having won 2 of those seriously important races. The horse I put second was actually Mage, because when you start to break it down, the Kentucky Derby win matters a lot. And when a lot of these horses only have 1 grade 1 win, well, his grade 1 of the Kentucky Derby just matters more than a win in the Pennsylvania Derby or the Haskell or the Santa Anita Derby. So I put Mage second. And in a tough call, I put Go Rocket Ride third. His summer was fairly strong, winning the Haskell and just barely losing the Pacific Classic against older horses. I briefly toyed with the idea of putting Derma Sotogake in there, because I don't think we should just ignore the fact that he was second as a 3-year-old in the Breeders' Cup Classic, probably along with Auguste Rodin, one of the best 3-year-old performances of the year in isolation. But if I'm going to apply that standard to Auguste Rodin, that I don't want a horse based on just 1 performance, and I know Derma Sotogake ran twice in the country, but it was almost like he ran once because his Kentucky Derby wasn't really a competitive effort. So if I'm applying that standard to one horse, I can't suspend that logical thinking for the other. So my ballot was Arcangelo, Mage, and Go Rocket Ride.
I do want to touch on just one thing you brought up, and that's the graded stake system. And I kind of echo your sentiments. I pay less attention to the official gradings than I ever have. And frankly, it's becoming archaic. They just don't really apply to me. I guess they mean something to breeders still, but as somebody who's a fan of the game, we know what the best races are, and I like what you did with your system, you differentiating between them. There's even some grade 2 races, which I would probably give more credit than some of the grade 1s we saw this year. So just wanted to mention that, yeah, as far as official gradings, they carried very little weight for me.
Yeah, and I think the most recent decisions that were handed down from the American Graded Stakes Committee just made it more clear than ever that there are some significant biases within that committee, that maybe the breeders and owners and whoever else is comprising that committee are not the people that should be making decisions about how many graded stakes there are, because I think that group has personal incentive to have there be as many graded stakes as there can be. And the proportion of graded stakes to the number of horses running is just totally out of whack. And unless you're just going to cut out a third of the graded stakes across the board, which I think would be the right thing to do, downgrading and slashing a bunch of graded stakes races, because there are just way too many. I mean, just tweaking graded stakes, moving up and down by circuit, and showing just such obvious favoritism to certain circuits over others. I mean, I think it really tarnishes the reputation of the graded stake system in this country. And to upgrade a race like the Franklin Simpson at Kentucky Downs that is so obviously undeserving of that status based on who's participated in that race, and it just makes you wonder what happened behind the scenes to allow for that to happen when almost every objective person realizes that's wrong. It really brings into question the impartiality of that committee. So unfortunate, but I think you do have to go through that exercise of deciding what are the real important races. And I mean, I think everybody knows that races like the Kentucky Derby don't need to be labeled a grade 1. We know what the really important races are: the Derby, the Breeders' Cup Classic, and it's almost an insult to those races that they're a grade 1 and the Gamely in California is a grade 1, or the Franklin Simpson at Kentucky Downs is a grade 1. Those are not races that are on the same level or even have divisional implications, whereas the Kentucky Derby could decide a champion. The Gamely and the Franklin Simpson barely enter the conversation of who is a champion. So I think some of the people making these decisions might want to look to how the graded stake systems work in other countries and what's really constitutes a grade 1 race, because I think we've really lost the plot in the US in terms of how we're grading these races and the favoritism that we're showing towards certain circuits. It just it really, as I already said, it tarnishes the entire system.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I don't want to go into this too deep, but the system needs a major overhaul. And I think it starts with the people making the decisions. They've proven basically biased and inept, unable to do the job right for whatever reason.
Craig, I'm interested to know if we agree in the other 3-year-old category, the 3-year-old filly category. Another situation where I think Pretty Mischievous is probably going to win this award. I think she's just in the minds of most voters. She's been the leader of the division throughout the year, and she was, I guess she kind of maintained her status as she skipped the Breeders' Cup. It wasn't clear exactly why she skipped the Breeders' Cup to me. I mean, I don't want to speculate, but I could imagine looking at the Breeders' Cup distaff and just kind of deciding she was probably only going to lose stature if she ran in that race. I didn't see what the setback was that she had, but she did not participate in that race. I ended up voting for randomized because when I started to make my list of accomplishments and assign a point value to them, I came up with randomized and Pretty Mischievous earning the exact same number of points on my system, because I give a lot of weight to a second place finish in the Breeders' Cup distaff versus some of the mid-season grade 1s that Pretty Mischievous won. And then I think when you start to dissect Pretty Mischievous's grade 1 victories, personally, I have trouble viewing her test as a grade 1 victory, just given the circumstances around that race. We don't have to rehash. Everybody knows what happened. And I just think it's, on paper, 3 grade 1s versus 1 grade 1 sounds pretty cut and dry. But when you start to look at who actually stepped up and faced older horses and ran against the best, and who sort of ducked them at the end and participated in some grade 1s of maybe lesser value and eked out some victories that maybe were not as clear cut, I ended up being a little swayed by that, and I voted for randomized in a pretty close call.
Yeah, it was basically a 50-50 for me. I went the opposite direction. I went with Pretty Mischievous over randomized. Have no problem the other way. It was almost a coin flip for me. The deciding factor that I settled on was that Pretty Mischievous basically won the 2 most important 3-year-old filly races of the year, the Oaks and the Test. Granted, the Test came with an asterisk. She probably wasn't going to win without the unfortunate incident we saw, but in the end, she did win. So I went with her, but I could have just as easily went the other direction. As I said, it was a toss-up. I put Maj in third. I thought she ran great in her 2 starts here in the U.S., and I had trouble coming up with any other viable candidate. So that was my 1, 2, 3. Pretty Mischievous, randomized, and Maj.
Yeah, we both had Maud third. She did run twice in this country, and to me, that was enough to include her. Not going to put a turf horse like that with a limited U.S. campaign on top of the two that we already talked about, but I get it, going in the opposite direction between Pretty Mischievous and Randomized. I always like to give credit to the horses that ran in the best races in the division. And the Breeders' Cup Distaff was the toughest race that a 3-year-old filly could have run in last year. And Randomized ran well in it. So I just wanted to give her the nod based on that. But I totally get going in the other direction. Let's move on to the older male and older female categories on the dirt. Older dirt male, this is an interesting one, Craig. We both included Cody's Wish in our Horse of the Year selections, not our top selection, but in third. But I think you can look at the older dirt male category differently if you want to, because we do have a few contenders for this award, Cody's Wish obviously being one of them. You have to decide what to do with Elite Power, Cody's Wish's stablemate, who obviously came on strong at the end of the season in the sprint division. I guess that also is part of the older dirt male division, if you want to view it that way. And then, of course, there's White Abario, who won the Breeders' Cup Classic. And I could not include White Abario in my Horse of the Year selections for the reason I laid out when we talked about it, that he just didn't have that longevity of campaign. He wasn't good for long enough. But when I'm looking at the older dirt male category, I think the Breeders' Cup Classic results do matter a lot. It's the championship race in this division, whereas the Horse of the Year is a little more nebulous, and it's not just the winner of the Breeders' Cup Classic. I think there are a lot more factors to take into account. I ended up switching it up in my older dirt male votes, and I put White Abario on top of Cody's Wish, just because I thought that they had very similar accomplishments at the end of the day. They both won races that were important. Cody's Wish, the Met Mile, White Abario, the Classic. They both lost some important races. White Abario finishing third to Cody's Wish in the Met Mile, and Cody's Wish finishing third to White Abario in the Whitney. I thought Cody's Wish's loss was a little more disappointing than White Abario's if we're going to compare those two results. But White Abario, I mean, obviously ended his season on a strong note, and I just ended up giving a little more preference to the Classic versus the Dirt Mile. But I totally get somebody that says that I'm being contradictory, putting Cody's Wish in my Horse of the Year vote and switching it up for the Dirt Male.
Well, I did not switch it up. I went with Cody's Wish first, but I get the argument. This is another very tough call. I actually put Elite Power second because I thought he just did the most all year long. Not a big fan of giving sprinters. It would have taken quite a bit for me to vote him first over Cody's Wish, but I went with him second. I went with White Abario third. I have no problem with anybody voting for White Abario, but to me, he just didn't do enough. I try to look at these as older dirt male for the whole year, and he was basically non-existent for 7 or 8 months. And after that, he won 2 races. It's not like it. Maybe if he'd had a third, well, definitely if he'd had one in between, I would have had him higher up. He might have even been my Horse of the Year. But I don't want to be getting in the habit of rewarding horses that don't run very much, don't win very much. Unfortunately, we had to do that with Flightline last year, but he was just so dominant. There was no way to get around it. But in this case, I just preferred the horses that ran basically all year long and held their form. And I gave Elite Power some credit for his win in Saudi too, which I think we are supposed to do when it comes to horses who race in the U.S. We are allowed to count their overseas races.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally get that. I put Elite Power third, and I understand there's a case to be made for him. I know some people even considered him for Horse of the Year. Personally, I didn't, just given I think that we would both agree the sprint division has been a little bit weaker in recent years than some other divisions. It's not ideal voting for a horse who was only good for half of the year, like White Abario was. But like I was saying back to the discussion earlier, I just want to reward the horses that ran in the tough spots. And I'm not going to view a win in the Breeders' Cup Classic and a win in the Dirt Mile as on equal footing. Even though this was not the toughest Classic that we've ever seen in terms of star power, it was a much, much deeper race than the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile of this year's Breeders' Cup. And White Abario was a more decisive winner of his tougher race than Cody's Wish was of his easier one. And Cody's Wish probably did produce a performance that was at the level or perhaps exceeded Barrio's Breeders' Cup Classic when he won the Met Mile. But to me, Cody's Wish was not at that level for the entire year. He had a dip after that. So that kind of swayed me a little bit towards the horse that really came on strong at the end of the season. But I understand. It was basically close to a coin flip for me. And I just went towards the factors that really matter to me a little bit more. But I totally view somebody looking at it slightly differently. Moving on to the older dirt female category. I think this one's a little more straightforward, Craig. I can't imagine that either of us went against Idiomatic.
No, this one was pretty easy for me. I went Idiomatic. I put Goodnight Olive second, and Echo Zulu third, just because I had trouble really finding somebody. And I thought she was just really, really good until she was unfortunately injured, just dominating the sprint division. Not enough to put her in front of Goodnight Olive because she showed up and she won the biggest races again. So I thought this one was pretty straightforward.
Our top three there, unsurprisingly, very similar. Moving on to the sprinter categories. Male sprinter, pretty straightforward. Elite Power, the obvious winner of this award. For second and third, Craig, I put Elite Power over Gunite and Cody's Wish. For Gunite being above Cody's Wish, I just sort of wanted to reward a horse that, when you look at his campaign, boy, did he run in every single important race. I mean, he was just motoring from the beginning of the season all the way to the end. Sure, he settled for second a few too many times to be the champion, but boy, I mean, he had a fuller campaign than a lot of horses on this list. So I wanted to reward him a little bit for that. And Cody's Wish only ran 2 sprints this year, so I couldn't put him higher than those other two.
Yeah, we have the same exact top three for the reasons you mentioned. I wanted to reward Gunite for a good full campaign and basically dancing every dance.
Now, for female sprinter, Craig, I'm guessing you voted for Goodnight Olive. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
I did. It's hard to take away her accomplishments. Yes, she wasn't as fast as Echo Zulu on her good day, and it's unfortunate Echo Zulu didn't make it to the filly and mare sprint, but she didn't make it. So I went with Goodnight Olive first. I picked Echo Zulu second, and I wanted to give a shout out to Maple Leaf Mel. So I put her third, not just because it's kind of a heartbreaking story, but I really thought she was that good, and she may have very well been a horse who could have won this award without her unfortunate incident. So wanted to give her some recognition that I thought was deserved. But for me, it was pretty clear cut. I didn't give much thought to any other order in this race.
Yeah, I think Maple Leaf Mel is going to be the third choice for a lot of voters, me included. There's really nobody else that's obvious to put in that slot, and she was so talented. And I mean, if ever a horse was going to win a Grade 1 race, she was going to win a Grade 1 race that would have made her in the conversation for this division. So, as far as the top two, this is one that I switched at like the very last second as I was submitting my votes, because I was stuck on a little bit and I kept thinking about it. And I ultimately voted for Echo Zulu as the champion. And my reasoning is this. I know that Goodnight Olive won the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint, and we generally consider the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint to be the championship race in the division. But when you start to go and look back at the fields, and this is kind of when I reference the grading of stakes races. I'm not saying that the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint should not be a Grade 1 race, but it's that exercise of thinking about the relative strength of races. And what was the championship race in the Filly and Mare Sprint division last year? I think it was the Ballerina, because you compare the relative fields, and the Ballerina attracted the type of field that you typically would expect to see in the Filly and Mare Sprint. The latter race came up kind of weak. It was almost like the Ballerina sort of weeded out some horses that we were otherwise going to see in the Filly and Mare Sprint at the end of the season. And obviously Echo Zulu unable to participate. She was probably going to run in the sprint instead, just given how dominant she had been over the females last year after her victory in the Ballerina. But when you go through that Ballerina field, everybody that mattered was in there. And Echo Zulu beat them soundly, including Goodnight Olive. I know she had an abbreviated campaign, only one Grade 1 victory. But when I started to go through it, she just achieved that victory in the one race, and she was brilliant in the others. I mean, the speed figures that she ran at Saratoga this past summer just leave no doubt that she was the most talented. And these aren't awards that are about just voting for the most talented horse, but I thought she was the most talented and she won the most important race in the division. So I ended up being swayed by that, and I voted for Echo Zulu on top.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. You make a good argument. If you ask me who I thought was the best horse, I would say it was her. I would say she might even been the best sprinter of the year. So you won't get any pushback from me on that one. I went a different direction, but maybe we had this before I voted, you might have swayed me.
As far as male turf horse goes, another category that looks pretty straightforward, up to the mark. If we voted for him for Horse of the Year, it's pretty obvious he's the winner of this award. I put Master of the Seas and Casa Creed as my second and third choices, but obviously distant choices behind up to the mark.
Yeah, we're basically the same, except I had Auguste Rodin in third, but I could see Casa Creed as well. No problem with that. But the first two were pretty much no-brainers.
The female turf horse, another imperfect set of selections. I wouldn't say that the horses that I listed as 1, 2, 3 are the most deserving compared to some past years, but you have to make decisions. And In Italian just had the strongest campaign from start to stop. I mean, she wasn't successful in the Breeders' Cup, and that's a bit of a strike against her. But I mean, she was in the exacta in a series of important races in this division. And at the end of the day, that was enough for me, because I'll just put it right out there, just based on the standard I previously applied, I'm not voting for a horse like Inspiral, even though she probably was the best female turf horse to run in this country last year. She just had one race, and I just am not voting for horses like that. So In Italian was my choice.
And I don't hold firm to that. So I went with Inspiral. I thought she was clearly the best female turf horse. I went with Maj second and Italian third. I really liked what I saw from Maj, so I hope we do get to see her next year as well.
Yeah, I also put Maj second in this category. Ran twice in this country, beat some good 3-year-old fillies, and then almost won the Breeders' Cup Mile. So that's enough for me to include her. And for third, I put Warlike Goddess in, who did not have her strongest campaign in 2023, but she did win a grade 1 against males. It was not the strongest grade 1. And if we're going to talk about the relative strengths of grade 1s, I mean, she beat one of the softer fields that was assembled in that Joe Church Turf Classic, but did it quite decisively. And looking back at it, I mean, I don't want to make too many excuses, because Eclipse Awards is not trip handicapping, but when you watch the Breeders' Cup Turf back, I mean, she was never put into a position to be competitive in that race. So I don't want to be too hard on her for the loss. And I mean, her one victory in that Turf Classic, it stands up pretty well against some of the others that I could have put in, like Gina Romantica, or I guess some people might even vote for a horse like Anna Zet, who has 2 grade 1 victories, though to me, those are not nearly on the level of the top level races that some others won.
No, as we talked about the graded system before, I didn't pay much attention to those. Not that I think Anna Zet's not a very good horse. She is, but she was beating very little.
Moving on to the Steeplechase horse, a category that I think I said I wouldn't be surprised if there were a record number of abstentions here, because people don't vote for this award even in years where it's clear cut, and it's certainly not this year. And it seems like a difficult one to really settle upon anybody. So I could see some extra voters abstaining just because they can't make up their minds, even if they had intentions to vote. I put out that thread on Twitter where I laid out my thought process, not so much because I'm saying that people have to vote in the steeplechase category. I know people have different feelings about that, and that's fine, but mostly just to kind of go through the process of how I think about the Eclipse Awards and voting, even when I think it's tough and there's not a clear winner. That's just my philosophy on it. So it was just sort of using that category, an example of how I think about things. So I already laid it out if people want to look at it, but I'm voting for Snap Decision. Failed to win a grade 1, but I think the difference between the grade 1s and the grade 2s in the steeplechase world is not necessarily as clear cut as it might be in some other divisions. There's no Breeders' Cup. I mean, there's no series of races like the Triple Crown. And Snap Decision did win a couple of grade 2s. He carried a lot more weight than some significant rivals in one of those wins. And he had a grade 1 second place finish to a very good European horse early in the season. It's not as strong as a campaign as most winners of this award have. It's not as strong of a campaign as Snap Decision has put together in prior years when he's come up second in the voting. But I think he's deserving to finally win this award.
Well, this is one I actually did a point system similar to what you did for other races. Tiering grade 1s, grade 2s, grade 3s, because with steeplechases, I pay more attention to them than I do thoroughbreds, which is kind of silly, I guess. But I wound up going with Snap Decision as well. He just came up with the most points pretty clearly based on his grade 2s and his second and a grade 1. I put Merrymaker second and Belfast Panther third, but it was basically just a points thing. And I'm happy to see him win it. Had it come out close, I probably would have given it to him anyway. Just, I know you mentioned in your Twitter or X thread a Lifetime Achievement Award, and if there was ever a year to give one, this would be the one. But I think he's a deserving winner just based on his performance this year as well. So I'm good with my vote here.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously had a strong campaign when he came up second in the voting to the Mean Queen a couple of years ago. I thought he should have won it last year when they gave it to that European horse, Hewick, who came in for, I think, one race. It's not a Lifetime Achievement Award, but he's very much in the mix for this award this year, just based on the fact that everybody else basically just has one major win on their resume, and he's got a couple of maybe just slightly below major wins, and he's got that whole body of work that makes him the horse in this division that you really measure all of the others against. As the person that I look to is the jump expert Joe Clancy said to me in a response, if they ran a handicap in this division tomorrow, he'd be giving the entire field weight and would still be a significant favorite. And I think that's something that you have to think about. So Snap Decision, he was pick there. And I'm starting to think he's going to win this award, Craig. I wasn't quite sure about it when I put that thread out, but I think a lot of people are viewing it the same way. Moving on to the human section of the Eclipse Awards, owner and breeder, I tried to look at it a whole bunch of different ways, Craig, and I just found it really difficult not to vote for Godolphin in both.
Yeah, I did the same. They just had dominating statistics this year. And I don't want to penalize people because they breed a lot of horses. I mean, we need people like this in the game. So with the shortage of horses that we have, I don't want, even though they're a big conglomerate and have tons of horses, I think that's a good thing. So maybe they should be rewarded. So for owner, I went with them first, Carvet Stable second. And I gave a shout out to Mage's owners. Ramiro Restrepo's the one individual, but there's also some other co-owners, a couple LLCs, but that's who I put for third, just because I think for a small group like that to own the Derby winner is impressive and worthy of recognition.
I totally understand that. I had similar choices there. I just put Juddmonte Farm in for third. I mean, they did campaign 2 champions this year in Elite Power and Idiomatic, so included a shout out to them, but similar choices there. For breeder, I kind of went with the stats for my top 2 choices. I put Godolphin over Stone Street, who did breed some significant horses this year. And for third, I put in Ram Spring Farm, who was the breeder of Up to the Mark, my selection and our selection for horse of the year. So just wanted to give a shout out to a smaller breeding outfit there.
And I did similar. I went Godolphin. I went Calumet Farm second. And I went Grandview Equine third, the breeder of Mage.
For jockey, again, Craig, just really hard not to vote for Irad Ortiz Jr. I mean, he had an outstanding year to be the leader in earnings as well as the leader in victories, and not close in either category, just running away with it. Riding in top level races. I mean, say what you will about whether you're a fan of Irad or not and some of the tactics he uses, but he knows how to stack up those accomplishments at the end of the year. You just, if you're going to respect the stats, you can't not vote for him.
No, I'm not a fan of his tactics, as we've talked about many times on here, but you have to disassociate that from winning the Eclipse Award. He was clearly the best rider this year, and any category that was available. And even probably if you just made up some trying to beat him, he would still come out on top. So he was clearly the top jockey. He got my vote. I went with Flavian Prat second, which I thought was just as much of a no-brainer. And I went with Tyler Gaffalione third, who I think made a really big jump this year and could have a big 2024.
Well, we have the exact same top three in the same order there, and when you look at the stats, I could understand why. It was pretty obvious in this one, I thought, when you take into account those graded stakes wins and the earnings at the end of the year. I was sort of surprised when I looked at that earnings list and saw how high up Tyler Gaffalione was, and he really does deserve to be one of these three finalists. Moving on to apprentice jockey, another one of these categories where I wouldn't say that I was following super closely all year, but I obviously looked at the stats. I went back and reviewed where these jockeys were riding and the relative accomplishments to some of the local colonies. And I think there's a pretty clear winner in this category, Craig, in Axel Concepcion, who was riding primarily in the Mid-Atlantic region, Maryland and Delaware this year, was, I think, leading rider at Laurel once, towards the top of a few riding colonies. I think he's even had some success at Turfway at the end of the year, being second in the rider standings there currently, still an apprentice. So he seems like the very likely winner of this award.
Yeah, he got my first place vote as well. I don't know what it is about Maryland, but ever since I first got into racing, they've always had good apprentices. They seem to gravitate to the Maryland circuit. So I went with Axel Concepcion. I went with Sophia Vivis, I think you say, who rides at Woodbine and did very well on what's a tough circuit. And Jamie Torres third.
Yeah, I put Luis Rivera Jr. third, another apprentice that rides in New York. Of course, sort of ended the year a little stronger than Jamie Torres, but they both had very similar accomplishments, so I could understand voting for either one in there. I also had the Woodbine-based rider Sophia Vives second. I'm never quite sure how strongly we're supposed to factor in results in Canada. It's sort of it's by situation whether we view these as American or North American awards. I think for the human categories, we generally do view the North American statistics. I've kind of been unclear on that in the past. I was a little reticent to vote for, I think it was Kazushi Kimura when he won the award a few years ago, riding exclusively in Canada. But I mean, the voters seem to think I've got to expect the mass thought on this, that it's a North American award. So I think that's clear that you have to include Sophia Vives in that conversation. I will just say, I was doing some research on these jockeys, and I did notice that that Axel Concepcion did incur a long suspension or middle of this year for an incident at Delaware Park that involved a horse fatality. I just feel like I've got to mention that. I wanted to find video of it to just see if I could see what happened, to see if that's something that I should factor into the calculus when I'm deciding who really deserves this award. Like a lot of situations like that these days, that video has been completely scrubbed from the internet. Couldn't find it. So I felt like it was unfair to base my decision on written articles about the incident. But I just wanted to mention that that's something that I might have taken into consideration if I had seen it.
Yeah, I could see that. He was so dominant, though. It would have had to have been pretty egregious. And as you say, with no video evidence, I didn't want to hold it against him.
And then finally, at the bottom of the list, the Trainer Award. Definitely not the least in terms of importance, but the final one that we'll discuss. When I sat down to look at the data, Craig, I balked a little bit at what I was expecting myself to do in this situation. But as I started to think about it a little more, and especially respect the graded stakes victories, which I think do matter the most in the Trainer Award, and the sort of ratio of graded stakes wins to the overall wins for a trainer in a year, I ended up going with Bill Mott. I mean, he just had such a strong year, campaigning so many top-level horses, especially in the sprint category with Cody's Wish and Elite Power, another champion in Just FYI, a horse like Warlike Goddess, one of the best female turf horses. I mean, the list goes on and on. The top horses that Bill Mott campaigned this past year, Casa Creed, who was also a finalist in a different division for me. And I just thought he had such a career year, and the group among the typical top-level trainers of Chad Brown and Todd Pletcher and Brad Cox was very close, and they all had good years, very good years by many of their standards. But Bill Mott, I think, really jumped up into that upper echelon this year with the number of good horses that he had in his barn, and I gave him the nod for my first place vote in the trainer category.
Yes, I did as well. I didn't think it was particularly close. I don't want this award to be a numbers game. I mean, I guess on some level it has to be, but it has to be about quality too. And I mean, this is a guy who is very likely going to have 3 champions, and one of those is going to be the horse of the year. So, numbers aside, I don't see how anybody else could overcome that. He had too many just very good horses, you mentioned, racing at the top of the game. They delivered on the biggest days of the year. So for me, it was Bill Mott. I followed that with Brad Cox, who numerically just had an incredible year when you look at it, just in all aspects: wins, money, races won, graded stakes. Good year. He would have won in any other year, but I just thought Bill Mott was too tough at the top. I voted Todd Pletcher third. It was a close call between him and Chad Brown for me. I even gave some consideration to Steve Asmussen, but at the end of the day, I thought this is Bill Mott's award to lose, and I would be very surprised if he doesn't win.
I went Bill Mott, Chad Brown, Todd Pletcher. I left out Brad Cox, like you said, when you look at the stats in terms of the earnings, especially. I mean, he leads the list. When looking back at the year, and like I was saying with regard to a lot of the equine awards, just really giving credence to the horses that won the elite grade ones, not just grade ones, but the grade ones that are the classics and the Breeders' Cups and the races that really are most important in the respective divisions. To me, given the stock that Brad Cox had, his year was a little disappointing as far as producing those champion horses. He campaigned idiomatic, but when you look through the list of who we nominated for these different divisional awards, Brad Cox's name is kind of absent, aside from idiomatic. So I just feel like he had a very good year, but he did not have one of those years that would make him the champion trainer. He didn't have those special horses. He didn't win the Kentucky Derbies or the Preaknesses. And I'm holding that against him a little bit because throughout the entire Kentucky Derby trail, all we talked about was how many good horses Brad Cox had and how he was just going to dominate the other trainers this year. And we get to the end of the year, and yes, he led the earnings list, but he didn't win those big races. So I left him out of my top 3.
Yeah, I've got no problem with that. Beyond Bill Mott, I could have put any of the next 4 I mentioned in there. So no argument for me on your choice. I mean, he won a lot of races, but yeah, we were talking about he might have 10 horses in the Derby at one time, and they all kind of fizzled out. So that's definitely a negative on his resume, I would say.
Well, Craig, that ends our Eclipse Award discussion. Hopefully that was enlightening for some people, or maybe you just wanted to skip past it if you don't care about the Eclipse Awards at all. I know some horse players feel that way, but I know we both try to take it pretty seriously. And like you said, it's a privilege to be able to vote for the Eclipse Awards. I know some people, will mock us for taking it so seriously, but I still think it's pretty cool. I mean, it's not like I've been working in this industry forever. I mean, it's still a relatively novel thing for me to get to be an Eclipse Award voter, and I just think it's a really neat privilege that I want to regard with a lot of considerate thought. And I know you feel the same way.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, it's something if people want to joke, that's fine. I'm pretty thick-skinned about that stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm a guy that loves to bet horses, but I love watching the horses run as well. And I love to see the best of the best, and I want to see them get rewarded. And at the end of the day, they're my favorite races to bet. I mean, I'll bet basically any race if I think it offers some value, but I just think the top horses running it gives it some special meaning for me. And that's something I hope I never lose. I mean, I'm 56 years old now, and I still have it, so I don't think I will. And this year we started new, and I'll be just as excited next year when this rolls around.
Well, Craig, let's finish up this TimeformUS Pacecast by doing what we usually do on the Pacecast and recapping some races from the prior week of racing. And we did have some nice racing over the holiday break. We're obviously not going to go quite as in depth as we normally would because we spent so much time talking about the Eclipse Awards. But I know you highlighted for me 4 speed figures from this past week in stakes races that you think would be worth talking about. And I kind of agree with the list that you sent me. So let's go all the way back to, I think, what you called the Horse Players New Year's Day, December 26th, when they ran the Malibu Stakes at Santa Anita. And yeah, they ran 3 grade ones on this card, but I think the Malibu is, you'd probably agree, was the only one really deserving of that status. And it was unsurprisingly Bob Baffert's Malibu.
It was Speedboat Beach, the horse who I had picked to win the Breeders' Cup Sprint. Didn't really run very well that day, but he got the job done in the Malibu. It's a race I'm not all that blown away. He got a 121 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a career best. So look forward to seeing him as a 4-year-old come back. But there are some things I think should be noted on this day. We do have it coded in red at TimeformUS, the bright red color, meaning it was speed favoring. I haven't really went back and reviewed it to see if I agree, but just watching the day, it did seem like up front was where you wanted to be. And this is also a race, so it kind of has the double whammy of all the fractions are coded in blue, meaning the horses up front just were able to kind of set things their own way. It was 2 Bob Baffert horses controlling the pace, and they just ran away from the field. So I imagine Speedboat Beach will be one of the top sprinters next year, but I do have some skepticism about how good this race was. A race which isn't on our list earlier on the card at the same distance. We had an older maiden, Judge Miller, break his maiden, running in basically the same time. Got a little bit slower, got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. That Speedboat Beach, I should mention, was downgraded a little because of the pace. His final time was 125, so a good final time number, but I do think there are some reasons to be a little skeptical.
And I did see when you put out these speed figures for the Santa Anita on this Tuesday card, some people were questioning the Malibu and the La Brea having figures that were as close to each other as they were, because obviously the Malibu went almost a second and a half faster than the La Brea. But that's all due to pace, correct, Craig?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, the final time difference wasn't that big. I mean, the La Brea, we didn't break it out or anything. As a matter of fact, we gave it the end to say we didn't break it out. Daddy's Ruby ran up with a 113. She got 4 points extra credit for the early piece. So 16-point final time difference. It's down to 8 points when we use the TimeformUS algorithms. Still a pretty big gap. I mean, in a sprint, that's a solid 3 lengths.
Yeah, and as for the Malibu, like you said, the pace was honest, but not particularly fast. I think you said color-coded in blue, and it was dominated towards the front end. Bob Baffert had those 2 speed horses, and they basically just ran around the track in front. I think the good news out of this race is that we're likely to see both Speedboat Beach and Hijazi racing this year as 4-year-olds. So you want to see those divisions have some quality 3-year-olds staying in training, and they're the perfect candidates, horses that didn't really participate or achieve in the top level races as 3-year-olds. So they still have something left to prove as 4-year-olds. Hopefully we get to see them, not just in California, but maybe in some major races around the country this year. Let's move on to Fairgrounds, where last Saturday they ran the Woodchopper Stakes, going the mile distance on the turf here. Northern Invader went off as the heavy favorite. Cherie DeVoe trainee, who had run a big speed figure on the turf, I believe at Aqueduct towards the end of last year, but had lost his most recent start in an off-the-turf race at Churchill to Gigante, and the result was the same, getting back on the turf, even though Northern Invader was made the favorite again. Gigante was able to run him down this day as well.
Yeah, it was an interesting race. It just kind of showed how good these 3-year-olds are, and I look forward to the older turf division. We've kind of lamented the turf horse division on the male side for a while, but I think that's about to improve this year with horses like Gigante and Northern Invader. They both ran 123 TimeformUS speed figures. None of these fractions were coded in red, but I think Northern Invader probably had the tougher end of it, being up battling on the pace. race, tracking a fast long shot on the front end. And it was a race that particularly picked up between the opening quarter and the opening half mile as he was trying to keep pace. So nothing lost in defeat. He definitely probably lost some more ground, I would say, early. He's a horse. They're both very, very good. If they just keep meeting, it's probably going to come down to trips, and there's several others out there. So it's more, I wanted to highlight this division. It's almost a shame to see it come to an end because it was so strong this year.
Well, the good news about the turf divisions is these horses generally don't retire at the end of their 3-year-old seasons, and we get to see them next year. So, as you were alluding to, hopefully these horses can continue on, maintain their form, or perhaps even improve as 4-year-olds, and that would make for a pretty deep division of turf horses this upcoming year. A lot to look forward to there. And Gigante and Northern Invader, they're not even near the top of that division. I mean, you've got horses like Integration and Program Trading who we're likely to see again. So a lot of potential excitement next year in that 4-year-old and up turf division. One more thing I'll mention about this woodchopper is watching it back, Craig. I think there was a horse that was a little bit unlucky in here, and that was the 3rd place finisher, Point Proven. There was a time around the far term where it looked like he was moving up following Gigante into the race, and he had a significant stumble at about the 5/16 pole before getting into the stretch that cost him some valuable momentum, and he was able to do well to get back up into 3rd, only beaten about 2 1/4 lengths after that, but probably cost his chance at the best placing he could have achieved.
Yeah, for sure. It was an athletic move to be able to get back underway and actually make the closing finish that he made. And he's another one to watch out for, because even though I mentioned the pace was a little bit on the quick side, even though it wasn't coded in red, when you look at the finishes, nobody else was coming from the back like he was. So it was impressive.
Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, also on the Saturday card, where the final race they ran that day was the Fort Lauderdale. And we saw a nice performance here from the top 2 finishers, actually the top 3 finishers. It was a blanket finish coming to the wire. Main Event got his preferred trip, causing the upset, leading throughout. Didn't look like there was a ton of pace on paper, and really nobody applied significant pressure to Main Event in the early stages, and he was able to set that sort of even, steady pace that he prefers and hold them off to the wire. Game run from the runner-up King Max, but Craig, as somebody who has been a fan of Jerry the Nipper and following him and made a point to tune in and bet him this day, kind of frustrating to watch him get yet another tough trip, and I think the 3rd place finisher was probably best in this spot.
I would definitely agree with that. That's a tough beat. And glad it was in 2023, so you can quickly put it behind you and move on to this year, because I think he was the best horse in the race. Main Event, the pace projector predicted he would be alone on the front end, and that's kind of how it went. And Jerry the Nipper got himself into a jackpot. Wasn't able to make it up at the end, but very good performance from him. Main Event ran a 1:22 TimeformUS speed figure, but I'm with you. I think Jerry the Nipper easily wins that race with a better trip.
Yeah, he was put into a really tough spot in the backstretch. I watching it back and then reviewing the head-on. I'm a little irked at Irad Ortiz, who was riding the overbet favorite Running B, who seemed like, even though he moved into the backstretch in the 3-path, thought he had every right to just muscle his way over into the 2-path and really cause that traffic jam that forced Jerry the Nipper to steady back. And anybody who thinks that the Ortiz brothers are colluding, Irad almost put Jose over the rail there on Jerry the Nipper. Stone Age was the one who ultimately bumped into Jerry the Nipper, but it was Running B on the outside who was applying that pressure, just moving into the 2-path, even though he had no right to be there. But we've seen that from Irad a lot, and the angles aren't so great at Gulfstream when you're looking at these head-ons, so I guess the stewards maybe missed it or didn't want to look at that. I still can't figure out why Running B was 6-5 in this race, coming off a victory against overmatched horses at Aqueduct. That was kind of befuddling to me, but these are connections that tend to take a lot of money.
Yeah, Running B ran next to last, so I'm not sure what looking at it would have done. It really couldn't have changed anything. I would imagine Irad's going to have a suspension coming his way for a different disqualification at Gulfstream, so maybe justice will be served.
And let's finish up our discussion of stakes races from this past week by discussing the Monday New Year's Day edition of the Smarty Jones for the newly turned 3-year-olds at Oaklawn Park. And I think we saw a promising winner of this race, Craig. Obviously, we're still a long way out from the Kentucky Derby. A lot can change between now and then, so don't want to make too many presumptions about what this race might, how important it might prove to be down the line. But you saw what you wanted to see from a progression standpoint for a horse like Catching Freedom, who only had 2 starts under his belt. It had a little bit of trouble in his prior race at Churchill Downs and was able to win this Smarty Jones going away at the end, like a little added distance shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, it was a nice effort. He got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure, so he's improved every time out. He did it from off the pace. Good effort. I'm a little dubious when I see a horse like Just Steel is able to finish second about how good the field was. Not that Just Steel is not a good horse, he is, but at this distance, I think it was really pushing the limits here and maybe make Catching Freedom look a little better than he ran. But he gets a 112 TimeformUS speed figure. He'll need to progress quite a bit as we move forward, but these are just newly turned 3-year-olds, so that's probably to be expected. He's one that I'm sure will be on many people's Derby radar, though. For me, a lot of people brought it up. It's just way too early to worry about the Derby. I'm just more worried, will he show up in the next round, which I guess is the Southwest Stakes. Probably won't, given the way racing is. Maybe the Rebel would be next, or it's Brad Cox. So who knows? He could show up anywhere.
Yeah, we'll see where they decide to go. Brad Cox obviously dominated this race last year and really dominated the scene in Arkansas moving through those 3-year-old races. So we'll see if it's the same story this year. Yeah, Just Steel, he's a nice horse. Like you, I wonder how far he really wants to go. But I mean, he's danced in the dances for Dwayne Lucas, as we typically see, and seems like he's benefited from that ample experience that he's able to accumulate up until this point. He was coming off a career best effort in that stakes win sprinting at Churchill and was able to actually better it a little bit here. So good effort from him. Informed Patriot, who was third, a little bit unlucky, tried to go inside of the top of the stretch, had to back out of there on altered course, but he was never beating the winner on this day. Nice way to kick off, I guess, the Kentucky Derby Trail. We can say that since it's January 1st, but a long way to go and many racing still to be run. So we'll talk about it all, Craig, as we continue recording these TimeformUS podcasts through the rest of 2024. But glad to get things kicked off with you in a new year.
Yeah, it's good to have a break, but it's also good to be back. We'll be doing the forecast this week. We'll be doing some video previews of some of the stakes races coming up. So, yeah, the break is good, but I actually miss doing it at times. So looking forward to this week and continuing these throughout the year.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, everybody, thanks for tuning in. And as Craig said, make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up on Friday.